Good afternoon, everyone. I've got 2 minutes past the hour, so we're going to get started as folks continue to trickle in. Thanks so much for joining us today. If you're not familiar with us, my name is Ian Adams. I'm with Evergreen Climate Innovations. We support entrepreneurs that are bringing impactful technologies to market in the climate solution space. And our work is focused on the Midwest United States. So we leverage philanthropic dollars to use as catalytic capital to invest and support in these companies. As part of that, we're excited to be here today with our Channel Strategy 101 webinar, a resource for startups in the space. Just a couple notes. The Q&A function will be on, so as you have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to ask questions, and we can either answer them as we go or at the end. We'll make sure we have time for that as well. Now I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Eric Burkert, CEO of Evergreen Climate Innovations, to introduce our speaker today. Eric, over to you.
All right, Ian, thank you. And thank you to everybody for joining us on today's webinar on channel strategy. My name is Eric Burkert. I am the CEO of Evergreen Climate Innovations, and my role is to lead the organization in our mission of bringing climate tech innovation to market. Ian covered some of what I was going to say, which is great. So what I'll do is I'll just leap right in and just say that I have the pleasure of welcoming Jim Fogarty of Frank Lynn Associates to share his channel strategy expertise with us. Jim and I worked together many, many years ago when I was at Frank Lynn Associates. And, one of my greatest learnings from my time there is that channel strategy and working with channel partners is a greatly misunderstood business discipline. And across my career, I've witnessed too many companies sign up distributors, resellers, partners, and then sit back and wait for magic to happen. And it usually doesn't if you're not thoughtful about it. So let's have Jim talk to us about how to be thoughtful about thinking about channel strategies and what some of the kind of fundamentals of successful channel strategies are. Jim?
Eric, thank you very much. Greatly appreciate the introduction and your thoughts regarding channel strategy. I did like the way you framed that. What I'd like to share with the group, and just share with you to begin with, just absolute pleasure to be with you today. As Eric and Ian and Allie and I talked about this session, we thought about what might be helpful to share during this particular conversation today. And we came up with the following agenda. And what we've done is really express them in terms of objectives. So through the course of this conversation this afternoon, we would like each of you to develop a channel strategy vocabulary. So language that you can use to discuss sales channels and to discuss channel strategy. And so when you're actually working through a channel strategy, you have a framework to fall back on as a way to think about not only designing the channel strategy, but understanding if you've thought about all the key elements that should be included in it. So we want to give you the vocabulary. We would also like to share with you a framework and a way we think about channel strategy and focus in on the key elements of it. So those are going to be defined terms, and I'll share that with you as well, and some thoughts regarding those. As Eric mentioned, being thoughtful about channel strategy design and selecting the right type of channel partners, and again, I'll define that term, it's helpful to think about where we are in terms of the market life cycle. So what type of channels should we be considering at what point in time? So the market life cycle informs that thought process. The idea of channel window, understanding what types of characteristics and capabilities we need from our channel partners to be successful, we refer to as channel window. So we'll talk about that. In a sense, it defines what good looks like and helps us understand if we are selecting the partners that will be able to successfully market and sell, and depending on our expectations, service and maintain relationships with our target end users. So we'll refer to that as the channel window. And then importantly, another idea is around channel mindshare. To what extent can we expect a channel partner to proactively invest their time and energy on our behalf? Particularly if that sales channel, and again, I'll define that term, is selling other products, other services to our target end users or others. How much of their energy are they going to proactively invest in us? So we'll talk about Mindshare. I'll share with you a framework that helps calibrate that, and then in a sense help establish realistic expectations for what they can do on our behalf. So we'll talk about that. That does beg the question, and then in terms of how can we improve our Mindshare position, which we'll likely talk about as well. And then lastly, when we talk about key elements of a channel strategy, one of the terms I'll introduce is the idea of a market coverage model. And arguably that's kind of the core of the channel strategy. And so I'll share some thinking around designing a market coverage model and provide some examples. So those are our objectives. In terms of how we'll go about doing that, as you would imagine, we'll go kind of walk through these topics in order. So we'll start with the language and the terms. We'll transition and talk about the concepts, which will set us up for a successful conversation on designing the coverage model. And then as Ian mentioned, we will pause and set time aside at the end to discuss questions and other topics that you may have. And also Ian mentioned that he will be monitoring the Q&A function and the chat function. So I will periodically pause as we go through this conversation and ask Ian and or Ali to share relevant questions that have come across that they think will be helpful to address as we have the conversation. So that's our plan. That's how we're going to spend the next half hour or so together, 40 minutes, through this conversation. And so I will transition now and talk about language or terms. So what exactly is a sales channel? I've probably already said it 5 or 6 times. And so I want to share that with you. And I'll start with a consumer example just to orient everyone to sales channels, to ideally an example that will be familiar to all, and that's Coca-Cola and Coca-Cola products. I mentioned that Eric and Ian and Ali and I had conversations about content, and I asked them when we were having that conversation where they purchased Coca-Cola products, assuming they did, and they all said they did. And they gave me all kinds of different examples. They talked about buying Coca-Cola products at grocery stores, buying it when they're out on the road and stopping to fill up their cars, assuming they still have gas internal combustion engines in their cars, stopping at restaurants, when they're at the ballpark. And yes, this is Wrigley Field, since all 4 of us are from the Chicago area. Unfortunately, the Cubs are about 500 right now, but we do periodically go out to the ballpark, and we will have drink some beverages there, so we can purchase Coca-Cola products there as well. When we're traveling and visiting hotels, that's available to us, as well as we may take vacations on cruise ships or even go to vending machines. So there's this whole host of places that we as individual consumers can go and purchase Coca-Cola products, either or when we want to buy them, and in some cases, not only buy them, but consume them on spot. So when we think about sales channels, it's really where companies make their products available for sale to their target end users. So when we think about Coca-Cola products and think about their channel strategies, I thought I'd ask a few questions around the channel strategy to start orienting us to some thinking that we may have or thoughts we might want to go through as we design one. So the first one, it really asks the question, why is Coca-Cola sold in so many different places? In a sense, this is a question that relates to their coverage philosophy. And I've already mentioned you can get it in many places. I would almost suggest it's ubiquitous, that you could buy it anywhere that you would want. So in the language that we tend to use around channel strategy, and particularly when I talk about principles and policies, I would refer to this as an open distribution strategy. They want to be everywhere that individuals that would like to purchase and consume their products want to do that. And so that's an open philosophy. For many of you, if you're in the early stages of a market life cycle, a new technology, a complex technology, that is not likely to be the most robust coverage philosophy for you. Many of you may think about being more selective or even highly selective. I will utter the word exclusive, But I do that in the sense of being highly selective as opposed to creating an exclusive relationship in a contract that may limit your degrees of freedom as you grow as a business. But nevertheless, the philosophy, open or ubiquitous. When we think about, just answered the second question, the coverage philosophy, Coca-Cola is thinking about what they want to strategically accomplish. And arguably, if you believe this, at one point in time, I think they thought about share of throat, that they wanted to capture as many consumers that are drinking beverages and make sure that's a Coca-Cola product that those consumers are drinking. And so that was their philosophy. So to increase their share of throat or maximize that, they wanted to be everywhere where an individual was going to be buying and consuming beverages. One of the questions you think about in designing a channel strategy is, to what extent do I create conflict? And that, in terms of what I've shared here, is the idea, to what extent will we discourage, through our coverage philosophy, our channel partners from reselling our products? I would argue that the gas station owner that is selling Coca-Cola products is not too concerned that the restaurant down the street or the hotel down the street is also selling Coca-Cola products. So arguably for Coca-Cola, they don't have much conflict and they're not discouraging partners from reselling their products. But I wanted to share a few questions that we oftentimes think about as we're designing or refining our channel strategy. And importantly, when we think about designing it, companies are designing their channel strategies so that it aligns with their strategic interests. So for Coca-Cola, that's driving share of throat. For you, it's probably more appropriately expressed in terms of market share. And then enabling their target end users to buy their products and services where, when, and how they want to do that. So that does suggest that our channel strategy is grounded on a very intimate and understanding of our end users, and then what they buy, how they buy, and where they prefer to source. So we'll come back to that as an idea. So that's the first discussion around sales channels. More formally, when we think about what exactly is a sales channel, we have a very broad definition. I would suggest to you it's anything that moves goods or services, communication, and money between your organization and your target end users. So very broad. Why do we think about that way? So when we are designing the channel strategy and when we understand who our target end users are, we're considering the whole range of, or the full range of possible ways that they would want to secure your product, literally through their information searches, intercepting you and finding the brand and or the product and technology, all the way through the purchase, the installation, the commission, and the maintenance of the product as a solution as they're using it. So formal definition shared here. I'll transition and talk about sales channels in two different ways. So one category of sales channels we often talk about and think about are direct sales channels. So these are your employees that are involved in selling your products and performing a whole series of functions, selling related functions on your behalf. So they could be identifying and qualifying opportunities, assessing end user needs, creating proposals and generating quotes, negotiating and closing, etc. What I've illustrated here are a range of different titles, from strategic account managers to product specialists to inside sales. I draw your attention to those descriptors because when you think about direct selling roles, there is a whole range of different titles, many that are not even listed here. You can have people that are sales representatives, territory sales managers. I'm working with a company right now that refers to some of their field-based sales as RSRs. I actually never heard that before, but it's regional sales representatives. What sits behind each of these titles is a set of selling related functions that their companies want them to perform. And so the companies define those functions, they group those functions, and then they create a descriptor to describe the roles that individuals in those particular positions will perform on their behalf. The reason I set it up that way is because when we transition and we talk about indirect sales channels, again, there is a whole host of different descriptors for types of indirect sales channels. What differentiates an indirect sales channel from a direct sales channel is the idea that the direct sales channels are our employees. Indirect sales channels are third-party entities that we engage, in many instances contract with, to perform a set of selling related functions, I use that term broadly, on our behalf. And so when you, depending on your industry, even depending on your geography, meaning the United States versus various parts of Europe, Africa, Middle East, Asia, etc., even the language of channels changes. And so here again, I draw your attention to the middle of the screen. I've included terms like manufacturer sales reps, system integrators, value-added resellers, wholesalers, distributors, etc. And essentially, those are descriptors that are used to help communicate the range of selling related functions that those organizations perform on behalf of the manufacturers that they represent. So again, different industries have different labels and descriptors, even different geographies. So even the same channel, that indirect sales channel that performs the same range of functions could have a different descriptor. And what I find helpful is really to understand the range of functions that they perform, so that when someone tells me, oh, we sell through distributors, they describe the functions, then I can really calibrate on what that channel is doing on their behalf. Because not every distributor is the same. And again, across industries, you can get people referring to a channel as a distributor, but they may have very different functions. And that's going to be important in terms of your channel strategy, because you're going to think about the type of sales resource, direct, indirect, that might be appropriate to perform a set of functions on your behalf. So that's sales channels. Not surprisingly, companies often use a range of sales channels, both direct and indirect, to bring their products to market, to market and sell their products on their behalf to their target end customers. And so that's a first conversation around sales channels. Ian, I'm going to pause here for a moment and ask if there are questions or comments that you may have to, again, contextualize what I shared for companies that you're familiar with and are working with and are participating in this call today, or questions that they may have asked through the chat or the Q&A function.
Thanks, Jim. Don't have any questions right now, so I think we're okay to move on.
Excellent. All right. So we just talked about two terms, or the terminology. What exactly is a sales channel? The next term is what exactly is a channel strategy. What I would like to share with you is this idea that a channel strategy is really an integrated system that aligns the corporate objectives and is rooted in the dynamics of the market that it is designed to serve. And then it's supported by a whole mix of programs and people and processes and tools. So when we think about a high-performing channel strategy, we tend to think about it in a couple different groupings. The first one are the critical inputs. What do we need to know to inform the design of our channel strategy? So we start with strategic requirements. So remembering Coca-Cola, if they want to increase their market share, and they may be measuring it through share of throat, they may express their strategic objectives in terms of market share. They may think about it in terms of growth rates. They may think about it in terms of covering different geographies or verticals. So companies think about it and start to express requirements that they have for their channel strategy. So it informs the design of the channel strategy. Another critical input are the market dynamics. So if we think about, today is a wonderful example, the macro economy. So a lot of uncertainty in the market. Are we moving to a recession? When might that occur? How deep, how long, et cetera? And what's going to be the impact on the business and the market and the demand for our products and services? So macroeconomics, we think we spend a lot of time thinking about the end users. So who are we targeting? What are their profiles? How do they buy? Where do they prefer to source? So that's an example of another category that we're going to investigate and understand. The channel landscape is important. So what range of channels, so I'm using that again broadly, direct, indirect, can we use to cover and serve our target end users? and then understand what that landscape looks like. So if we do use the words, there are dealers in this market, there are distributors in those markets. We'll talk about those windows in a few minutes, but what do those business models look like? What's the range in those models? What's the range of functions that they perform? To what extent are they appropriate for us to consider aligning with to bring our products and services to market? So that's another element of market dynamics. And certainly competitors is another one. So we want to think about who the competitors are, not only direct competitors and adjacent competitors, but conceivably, depending on what your product and technology is, it could be an acceptable alternative. They've got other practices in place to accomplish what your products and services are designed to do. And they just may have a different way of doing it. And it's not necessarily in a product that they may not be using a product that has the same embodiment as yours. But we want to understand the market dynamics. That's going to inform the design. So the critical inputs are informing the design. The key elements are really what I would consider the core of your channel strategy. So we think about three elements here. Sales strategy, that is, we articulate who we're trying to, what end users we're targeting, what our value proposition is. So what is our offer, services, products, services, anything else that we want to bring to those or offer to those target end users, and what is the process that we need to execute to bring that value proposition to those target end users. That's our sales strategy. Once we understand that, then we can start evaluating the range of sales channels that we can use to bring that value proposition to those end users. And then what we do is depict that in a market coverage model. And I'll give you some specific examples of that in a few minutes. And then lastly, in the key elements, we think about principles and policies. How exactly are we going to implement and execute our channel strategy? So I talked about the idea earlier of a coverage philosophy for McDonald's or for Coca-Cola Open, being more selective, maybe highly selective for new products that are newer in the life cycle, but that's an example of a principle policy. And then lastly, supporting elements are the type of elements we need in place to be able to not only implement, but consistently execute our channel strategy. So we certainly think about the people we need, how we may organize them, the programs and the programs and support that we need to put in place to help and facilitate our sales channels, whether direct or indirect, to perform the functions that we would like them to perform. We think about how we'll manage those. So if they're a direct selling team, we have sales management practices. If it's indirect sales channels, oftentimes we think about that as channel management practices. And then certainly the enabling technology. How are we going to enable this process through the use of technology? So just wanted to share this idea of channel strategy, this notion that it's an integrated system, and there are multiple elements we think about as we design the channel strategy. So in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is continue, and I'd like to share with you a few concepts that I think are helpful to help not only frame the design of a channel strategy, but as you actually think about and do the design, it informs the decisions that you make. And so one of those is the market life cycle. So one of the questions that Eric asked early on was, at what point in time do we think about engaging sales channels, direct or indirect, and how does that change over time? We tend to find that the market life cycle helps us think through that. And so you're likely quite familiar with the life cycle, the market life cycle. We're framing it here as a market life cycle as opposed to a product life cycle. So if you think about the market for a type of product, even thinking about computers, going back to the late 70s, early 80s, when when the first personal computers came on the market, and then how those have evolved over the years, the difference in the variation of the product from a big desktop to a luggable to a laptop, and today, depending on how you think about your tablets as your computers, those are all product life cycles that have existed through the course of the market life cycle for personal computers. And we'll also think about early adopters as well as early mass market, late mass market, and laggards as a way to kind of think through the end users that we're targeting and how they buy. But importantly, at the early stages of a market, when we first bring a technology to market. We're engaging with often early adopters. Oftentimes, there's not a lot of familiarity with these products. So the horizontal access we express in terms of time, but I think more appropriately, it's helpful to think about how the end users buy at different stages in the market life cycle. So early on, new technology, oftentimes end users need a lot of technical support. So they're looking for channels, direct or indirect, that can provide that technical support to them. So oftentimes that comes in the form of direct salespeople, so employees of the companies that are bringing that product or technology to market, or there oftentimes are highly technical manufacturer reps, which would be a third party. So they're, in other words, agents that can work on your behalf to start to introduce products into the market. The key here is that they have the technical capability to be able to work with and help end users begin not only to understand the product, but integrate it into their systems, whether it's a manufacturing environment or a commercial environment. As the technology takes hold, the market starts to increase, the number of participants increase. Oftentimes, companies think about introducing indirect sales channels, more indirect. So it could be the system integrators that I mentioned earlier, or value-added resellers. Again, the key here is that they tend to be highly technical channels, technically competent to introduce the technology, the solutions, and how it integrates into the environment. And the value add they are primarily bringing is technical. Once the market starts to really take off, end users tend to become more familiar with the technology. They need less technical support, relatively speaking. And then, so as a consequence, companies start to think about introducing a more broad line type of channel. So their own direct sales team, where before they might have been product centric or product focused, they become pooled sales forces. So they're bringing a whole range of products to the end users. And then we get into what tend to be more logistically oriented channels like distributors or dealers. And then lastly, as the market matures, we get into far more efficient channels. So think about the internet as an example of that. What's also interesting to know, again, key is the horizontal. It's the evolution of the end users' buying process, their behaviors. So how familiar are they with the product? What kind of value add do they need? Is it technical? Is it logistic? And then that helps frame the idea around the type of channels that would be appropriate to use to go to market. And so another, I think, interesting aspect of this particular representation of the market life cycle is, as you look at any point in time, companies often use a host of different types of sales channels, and that allows them to intercept different end users that are just in different places with their familiarity with the product. So this is a framing tool that we oftentimes think about to say, okay, where are we in the market life cycle? What type of channels might be appropriate to use? And so it helps us with our consideration set. I'm going to transition and talk about two more tools, and then I'll pause and ask Ian to share if there are any particular questions. But the next one we refer to as channel window. I think this is quite helpful to think about, because when you are evaluating sales channels, whether even your own direct sales channels, it's really what are the characteristics and capabilities that they have to be able to execute the sales process and bring our value proposition to our target end users. So the window defines essentially what's required of a sales channel. I'll also say oftentimes we refer to this as what good looks like. And so in that context, when we talk about the window, what are the elements of the window? Oftentimes we want to understand the target end customers. So who do they target? Who do the channels target? What stakeholders do they engage in? What type of value proposition are they offering? So that you can think about the range of products that they tend to sell. Sometimes they'll refer to that as their line card. They may have services. What does that mix look like? What type of selling are they doing? Are they doing consultative sales consultative sales processes that are executed over a long sales cycle, or are they doing short transactional? Because we want to make sure that how they are selling aligns with how we need to sell and engage with our target end users. And then the list goes on. So we think about technical capabilities, operational capabilities, even the culture of the organization and the orientation of the management team. Do they have the business acumen to run the business? Do they have the technical savvy to offer our products? Are they growth oriented? So do they want to grow their business? But one of the punchlines on channel windows is this idea that the window defines where they can succeed. And so thinking about that, this is, again, what good looks like. This is what it takes to be successful. They built a business around it. They have an economic model that supports it. So another punchline is the idea that changing a channel's window is very difficult. So as you assess candidates and you think about different types of channels and even specific channel partners, thinking about their window is helpful, and determining the degree to which their characteristics and capabilities align with your requirements is very helpful. And if they don't align, what I just draw your attention to is that red box. Trying to make them change is very difficult because you're asking them to change their business model, and that's not likely an easy process for them, and they may not want to do that on your behalf. So as a consequence, it may be easier to look for another candidate than to try to change or win over the hearts and minds and change their business. So that's window. The next element that I'd like to touch on is this idea of channel mindshare. And so in this context, when we think about to what degree is a channel willing to proactively invest its time and resources on our behalf, that's what we refer to in terms of mindshare. And so many companies will engage channel partners. I think the way you said it earlier, Eric, is sit back and wait for the magic to happen. If we don't have mindshare or higher levels of mindshare, that magic is not likely to happen. So how do we understand what our mindshare position is? I'll share with you a framework that we use to sort through this issue. And there are two dimensions to this model. The vertical axis, we think about the channel partner's business and we break it into categories. So what are the categories of products and services that they sell? And how do they articulate it? And which ones are primary? So these are the ones that are dominant in their business. If we want to use a metric, this could represent 50 to 60% of their sales, this category of products. So that would be primary. Secondary products may represent 30-ish% of their total sales. And they are often products that complement their primary products. So when they're selling their primary products, this is a natural follow-in. So if you take a McDonald's example at a consumer level, when you wander into a McDonald's, oftentimes you're asking for a hamburger. That's their primary products. Their secondary products, what do they always ask you for? Would you like fries and a Coke with that? Those are their secondary products. Tertiary products tend to be about 10%, 15% of total sales for a channel. We refer to these products as bought, not sold, meaning that the channel doesn't typically proactively sell these types of products, but the customers, that end users, are asking for them. So again, using the McDonald's example, this could be everything else that's on their menu. You ask for the apple pies, cookies, ice cream, etc. They're not proactively asking if you want those, because they tend to be tertiary. But this vertical axis is viewed through the lens of the channel partner, the distributor, the dealer, the VAR. What are their primary categories of products? What are their secondary? What are their tertiary? And then from our perspective, we ask, where do we fit? In what category do we fit? The next dimension is, what is our brand position within that category? Are we the primary brand? It could be the only brand, so we could be exclusive. Or are we one of several and the first of many? Are we a secondary brand, so we don't get that primary position, but we're a preferred alternative? Or are we tertiary? Are we there to supplement or pick up kind of the balance of sales within category? Again, kind of calibrating on this. Primary, I would suggest, if you're the primary brand within a category, you're probably capturing 50 to 60% of the sales within that product category. And then secondary, 30-ish%, tertiary, 10 to 15%. So what happens when we can calibrate or start positioning ourselves if we're in the primary category and we start to think about our brand position, what's always been interesting to me, even if we're in the channel partners primary category, we could have, and we're in the primary brand position, we could have high mind share. If we're in the secondary brand position, we could have moderate mind share. And even if we're in the primary category, but we're a tertiary brand, we could have low mind share. So we can be in very different positions, even if we're in the channel partners primary category based on our brand position. And then the logic continues for if we're in the secondary position, depending on our brand position, we could have a moderate or low mind share position. And if we're in the channel partners tertiary product category, we tend to have low levels of mind share. What does this mean in terms of channel strategy design? Understanding our mind share position helps us understand the degree to which our channel partners, those entities that we're working with, will proactively market, sell, service, support, and invest in us and driving our business within their business. And so calibrating it and understanding it is helpful to begin with. And then that certainly begs the question of what, if anything, can we do to improve that position? And there's a lot of thinking around enhancing mindshare positions. So that's a topic we could take at a different time, but calibrating is a helpful first step. So that's the second view I wanted to give you. So we talked about third actually, the market life cycle being the first. So depending on our market life cycle, what type of channels do we consider? The second variable we talked about was channel window. What are the characteristics and capabilities that are required to be successful on our behalf? In other words, what does good look like? And then this mindshare position is the third that we talked about. So with that, we're going to transition and talk about coverage models. Ian, I will pause for a moment and see if there are any questions that you think would be helpful to answer at this point in time.
We can actually save it for, we have a question, but we can save it to the end.
Okay, very good. Appreciate it. All right, so I want to transition to the last topic. In a sense, I'll say bringing it all together. But when we think about channel strategy, oftentimes really the core of that is our market coverage model. What sales resources are we using to bring our products and services to market? So the language we use around that is market coverage model. I started out earlier with the idea that in designing a channel strategy, it all starts with the end user and understanding not only who they are and what their profile of those end users look like, but really dialing into their buying dynamics, understanding the process that they go through to purchase the type of products and services we offer, and then how they select the brands of product and services that they ultimately purchase. So it's really understanding the end users and understanding how they go about searching for and ultimately purchasing and using the types of products and services we offer. So philosophically, it starts with the end user. And with that understanding, that informs our design. And so I would say from a basic perspective, when you think about a market coverage model, if we can think about the world in terms of a pyramid of end users, where there are a handful of very large in the market that we're targeting, and then many medium and small end users, and we can think about think about our market that way. At the tip of the triangle, many companies will align direct selling resources with the largest customers. The idea being, depending on the market, they're highly identifiable, they are large. When they do purchase, they purchase at a level that justifies the investment of hiring, training, and deploying a direct sales resource or direct sales team. And the economics play out, and we can generate a fair return on the investment in the direct salespeople. Not surprisingly, when we think about medium and small, many companies will align indirect sales channels with them. So this is where we think about, depending on where we are in the market life cycle, system integrators, value-added resellers. If we're farther into the market life cycles, dealers and distributors and the internet, trying to cover the small and medium-sized businesses. I would suggest to you this is a general pattern that companies will use: direct at the top of the triangle, indirect at the middle toward the bottom of the customer triangle. But as you would expect, there are a lot of nuances, and companies will vary their market coverage model based on a variety of factors. And so what are those factors? We talked quite a bit about the market life cycle. So depending on where we are and what stage of the market life cycle, we may think about different types of sales channels and different mixes of them, as we discussed earlier. And then there's a variety of other considerations. So we've already talked about the stage in the market life cycle. If you look at the left side of this particular chart, when we think about the complexity of the products, the higher the complexity, it tends to start biasing to technical channels, and we think more about direct. However, it's not to suggest that there are not technical indirect channels, because there are, but in terms of biasing one direction or the other, we start to think about direct versus indirect. And it goes down the line. We can think about the sales process. Is it consultative? Is it transactional? We can think about the value of the product or service. Is it high? Is it low? Higher, we can tend to justify investments in direct. Lower, we tend to think about using variable cost, which would be an indirect sales channel, because we only pay indirect sales channels when they are successful. The frequency of the end user purchase. If it's infrequent, they tend to need more technical assistance, general statement. And if it's more frequent, they tend to be more familiar with it and can do much of the selection process on their own. And then the logic continues through the rest of these variables. And this document will be available to you at the end of this session, as well as the recording. So you will have this. I want to share a couple examples with you in terms of how companies have designed a market coverage model. So what exactly do these coverage models look like? I'm going to share with you, oftentimes companies will define the different dimensions of a matrix. And oftentimes we're drawing from elements of the sales strategy. So we'll think about including the type of end users that we're trying to sell to, elements of the value proposition, or elements of the sales process or functions that we have to perform. For this particular manufacturer, they make weighing products, so technical weighing products in industrial and in commercial applications. On the vertical axis, we thought that thinking about the products that they sell is helpful, because that helps us frame the channels that sell those types of products. And on the horizontal, we thought about the end users. And in this case, we expressed in terms of vertical markets that they target. So as it suggests, they are selling instruments and modules, their language. And then we included the very technical term widgets and sensors. And what we found was that the sensors and the instruments tended to group together. And then there were a set of, manufacturer representatives that had technically oriented, that sold across or do sell across their target vertical markets, and they tend to sell the instruments and sensors. To some extent, those manufacturer reps will occasionally sell what they also offer, which are modules that weigh products or help weigh different elements of a manufacturing process, if that makes sense. But what we also found was that there was a set of distributors, and in this case, they were industrial automation distributors that sold modules, and periodically, but not frequently, sold the instruments and the sensors. So for this particular manufacturer, they decided they needed two different types, and they do use two different types of sales channels. There are nuances within each category. So there are different models of manufacturer reps that they work with, and there are different types of distributors that they work with. But for them to cover and serve their target end users, in this case, vertical markets, food and beverage, consumer packaged goods, and chemicals, they decided they needed two types. In the next example, this is a manufacturer of robots. And what we thought in terms of dimensions on the vertical, it was helpful to think about size of customer. So are they big, are they small? Because that helped frame, or based on what we learned about the different types of sales channels, we saw that some were pursuing opportunities with very large organizations and some focus on medium and small. So that became a distinguishing variable. And then similar to the other coverage model that I shared with you, industry was a variable that made sense to think about. So their world, they broke it into manufacturing and logistics. And then within manufacturing, two different elements: opportunities on the plant floor itself, and then opportunities in the warehouse of those manufacturers. What we found was that for the very tip of the end user triangle, manufacturer sells direct to the very large of the large. There's a set of technical distributors that also sell not only to the large, but to the medium and small. And then there were system integrators that did both manufacturing or operations solutions and warehouse solutions using robotics. And then there was another type of system integrator that did both logistics solutions, and which then bled over into warehouse solutions on behalf of, and included the robots themselves. So for this particular manufacturer, they sold direct, they sold through 3 different categories of indirect. And even at the top, this organization philosophically, I would share with you, is channel focused. They want to make sure that they are selling through and supporting their indirect sales channels. So they're very reluctant to take deals direct. So they oftentimes engage their channel partners in selling direct. But this is an example of another coverage model. So for this supplier, they thought about their world in terms of the vertical markets that we sell to, the size of the customers, and then they mapped in their selling resources to understand where they were engaging those sales resources, and then how they were coordinating the activity across them, because they wanted coverage, but they wanted to mitigate the risk of destructive channel conflict. So they thought about that dimension as well, or that dynamic. So with that, Ian, that takes us through the topics. Quick time check, it's about 10 minutes to the top of the hour. And I think you mentioned that there was a question or two. What I'd like to ask the team from Evergreen, so Eric and Ian and Allie, if you've got comments that you would like to share to kind of contextualize what I've shared so far for the participants, you are more than welcome to do that. And then happy to pick up on questions.
That makes sense. Thanks a lot, Jim. You know, as you were talking about the fact that changing the channel window is very different, it occurred to me that that advice is probably relevant for dating as well. And sometimes we're talking about startups and investors, but also I think relevant for dating and for channels. You know, it's understanding who they are and if they're a good fit. It may be more important than figuring out how you can change them. You know?
Right. And that's a nice way to say it. We're essentially intercepting their models. We're not looking to change those models. We need to know and understand what they are. And if they align, that's wonderful. If they don't, we go on to the next.
That makes sense. I did want to get to a question we had. This was, for your context, this was asked before we went through the life cycle stages, but it was sort of asking it, you know, to what extent these strategies are mutually exclusive and how we should think about creating market confusion if a company is pursuing both a direct and an indirect strategy, and whether this evolves with the maturity of the business. I think for the second part, you sort of said yes, but wanted to tee that up for you.
Yeah, I think that's an important question, because as we think about it, a lot of our work, as Eric suggested, is collaborating with industrial and commercial and technology companies to either refine or define their quote unquote channel strategy. And when some people use the term channel strategy, they think about indirect sales channels. My experience suggests is it's very helpful to think about an integrated channel strategy, meaning both direct and indirect, that you don't think about one without thinking about the other. As those coverage models at the end suggested, particularly the second one, I'll go back to that. In this particular case, the manufacturer was selling direct and they were focusing on the tip of the triangle, but they were also, because of their culture, very sensitive to the role of the indirect sales channels and making sure that when it was appropriate, that they engage the indirect sales channels, qualified indirect sales channels, into the selling process, their own direct selling process. So I would suggest that thinking about it holistically is very helpful and it's important, and that it's not mutually exclusive. Because one of the things that when companies are designing their channel strategy, they're balancing the tension between two things. They want coverage and they want to manage conflict. So the higher the level of coverage suggests, I'll say, more feet on the street, more sales resources. And then what they're trying to do is engender constructive conflict. They want to make sure that they have an adequate number of sales resources chasing deals, and they want to mitigate the risk of destructive conflict. They don't want too many sales channels chasing the same deals, so no one is winning enough to generate a fair return on those selling efforts that they're investing in. So the holistic, I think, is important, and I think about it as integrated as opposed to mutually exclusive.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I thought that was interesting where you mentioned that in this example, the second example, that the company was actually often trying to avoid selling direct, even though presumably that has better margin in favor of, sort of more global, holistic considerations.
Right.
We have a couple more minutes if folks have other questions. Right now, I think those are the questions we have, but we'll give it a second in case folks have any other questions.
And Eric and Ian and Ellie, I'd also encourage you, if there are perspectives that are helpful to share, you're welcome to do that to, again, contextualize comments that I made that may not have been well tuned to the audience.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, no, I think this is super relevant to a lot of the folks that have joined us. I guess one question that along those lines, how do you think about this this makes sense for, as you looked at the market life cycles and you're in those broader life cycles, but if we were to zoom in on that first initial cycle where a lot of the companies that we're working with are, do you have any specific comments there? I know you were saying generally things trends towards being more having more technical support services, being more direct focused at the earliest stages, but any additional thoughts or considerations if we're, say, assuming many of the companies on the conversation today are sort of in the process of their initial sale?
Yes, so a couple thoughts for you based on that question. When we think about entering markets, being able to identify and articulate the target market and the solution, and having comfort and confidence that that's a repeatable solution that can be sold to a set of identifiable end users is extremely, I would say, not only helpful, but important if we're thinking about engaging indirect sales channels. So like manufacturer reps or others, we need to be able to provide the guidance to them to say, here is the need, the problem that we're trying to solve. Here is that solution. And then here is the profile of the end user that benefits from this solution and requires it. And then here's how to articulate the value proposition. Because early in the markets, that clarity doesn't necessarily exist, and providing that clarity and that guidance, particularly for an indirect selling organization, because they're investing their own resources in it. They benefit from that direction. Another thought around, we talked about coverage philosophy, think about Coca-Cola, they're everywhere. Early in the market life cycle, coverage philosophies tend to be highly selective, with the idea that when we are asking a sales channel to invest on our behalf in a new market, that they're making investments, and what we're trying to do is provide them with adequate opportunities so they get a return on that. So we don't want to introduce too much competition early and allow them to be able to not only win, but to generate that return. So that's on the some indirect considerations. Other observations that early when we think about early stage markets, and this may be evolving, but historically we've talked about or thought about new technologies entering at the tip of the triangle, meaning the largest companies have the wherewithal to be able to invest, particularly if it's not a wholly defined solution, a known solution, and it requires experimentation, that the larger companies with the larger resources or greater resources tend to have the ability to invest and do that kind of bleeding edge work. So oftentimes that might be the place to look in the market for the target end users, and then helping, if we're focusing indirect sales channels, helping them focus on that. I would also say companies oftentimes early stage will be using their own selling resources. It could even be the founders or the evangelists and the sellers. But oftentimes companies, if they cannot afford to hire their own direct sales teams with that technical expertise, a lot of companies will look for manufacturer reps that have that technical expertise that in a sense provide a variable cost sales resource for them, because they're only getting paid when they're successful. But again, the window on that sales reps is really important to make sure that they've got the technical competency and they engage with the right set of people, and they have the skills to articulate the value proposition and help those end users work through their purchasing process. So
that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, you were as you were saying, sort of it needs, or as I was taking away from what you were saying, it really needs to be at a repeatable stage to be useful for the indirect side, right? Everyone sort of goes through this transition where there's these one-off sales and they're figuring out the value proposition. So until you get at that stage where you're repeatable, you may not be well served, pursuing those indirect sales channels.
I use this expression, Ian. It's not meant to be pejorative at all, but if it's still a science experiment, it's really hard to engage an indirect sales channel because they don't know or understand or have the ability to kind of withstand that type of selling cycle. Unless, of course, that's the model they have. So there are system integrators that love to solve engineering problems. And that's what gets them out of bed in the day, and they have a model that can support it. But that's the window issue. You have to know that they can do that. But once it stops becoming a science project and it's definable and repeatable, that's when you're in a position to introduce it to more mainstream channels, because they can start to sell it consistently.
That makes sense. Thank you. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time here, so I think it's a good place to pause and wrap up. When I say thank you again for everyone for attending, and a special thanks to Jim for joining us and imparting his wisdom. So thank you so much. I see Ali also posted there in the chat our link for upcoming opportunities and events. Thanks again, Jim.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation, and happy we've had the opportunity for the conversation today.
Me too. Thanks. Take care.
All right. You too.